Hi, my name is Evan. I'm one of the ministers at St Mary's Anglican Church. And today, for Psalm a Day, we're looking at Psalm 72. If you haven't read the psalm yet, then please go and do that before you watch the rest of this video. Because I'm not going to read the psalm myself, I'm just going to make some observations from little bits of it. So, the first thing when we look at the psalm as a whole, the first thing that I notice is the kind of psalm that it is. So, all over the Psalter, that's the combined book of the Psalms. There are lots of different kinds of psalms. There are laments, there are psalms of thankfulness or joy, there are psalms of praise. But this particular psalm we might call a royal psalm, that is talking about the king. That's the king of Israel and his relationship with God. And this particular king in question, according to the superscription, is Solomon. And so we might, if we take verse 20 into account, we might say that this is David's prayer for his son, for Solomon. We want to be really careful about not leaning too heavily on those historical details. But what I do want you to look at are the details and the image of the beautiful relationship that the King of Israel has with God, and it's reciprocal almost, that the King brings his people to God, and he brings the nations to God, and God blesses the King and blesses the people and blesses his nation. We can see that from the beginning, that God blesses the king. Verse 1, endow the king with your justice, and he will judge your people in righteousness. Verse 8, he will rule from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. The desert tribes will bow before him, and his enemies will lick the dust. And then we go into verse 10 and verse 11, where we see a wider picture of nations across the world coming to pay tribute to the King of Israel. Why do they come? Because of God and the way that God blesses the king. And then verse 12 and 13, they take on a bit of a strange flavour. It's almost as if the King of Israel himself acts in the place of God on earth. So look at verses 12 and 13. I'll read them out, and even perhaps 14. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy. He will rescue the needy from death. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. That sounds very much like what God is supposed to do, doesn't it? It really does. And so the King of Israel is really meant to be God's representative to the earth. And then the psalm finishes with praise to God. Now this psalm is a beautiful and a wonderful psalm. But when we do think through the history of Israel, and we do think through the history of her kings, it's quite a sad psalm, because none of her kings were like this. Because none of her kings managed to, especially perhaps not Solomon, even though he started off quite well, none of them managed to maintain their faithfulness to God in the face of all that the world could offer. None of them managed to put their people and their God first, or managed to serve their God wholeheartedly. At one point or another, all of them turned away from him. And so this psalm perhaps is a psalm about a king who never reigned. A psalm about an ideal king. The perfect king. Now, having the fuller picture of the Bible and the fuller picture of Revelation, we know that Jesus came to fulfill this role. Jesus came to be this king, to be the perfect king. That's what the writer of Hebrews spends a great deal of time telling us, that Jesus is the true Israel and the true king of Israel. And so particularly if we think through this psalm, all of these things we can see are fulfilled in Jesus, particularly those verses 12 to 14 that I read out before. That is Jesus' role. That's what Jesus came exactly to do on the cross. And reflecting on the way that Jesus rules the earth, verses 8 and 9, and then 10 and 11, how he brings the nations to him, he certainly has done that, hasn't he? And he's reconciled, according to Ephesians 2, the dividing wall of flesh between Jew and Gentile, and so now there is no division, there's no difference between who we are as people before God. And so because of this, because of who Jesus is, we all can stand united and say verses 18 and 19, say them in freedom. Freedom from our sin, freedom from fear of being judged, but most importantly, freedom under a perfect and wonderful King who loves us perfectly and follows God perfectly. Grace and peace to you.